Father George Williams. I am the Catholic chaplain at San Quentin State Prison in California. And welcome to our fourth webinar in the Catholic Prison Ministry Coalition series. Today, our topic is on how to remain resilient in the face of the environments we work in corrections. And I'm here with Eileen Dombo, who is a clinical social worker and a professor at Catholic University. I'm going to talk and hopefully give you some ideas and some insight into the nature of the difficulties we're challenged with our work in terms of stress and trauma, and how we can work against that in both with our self-care, our spiritual lives, in order to be able to maintain ourselves and continue to serving God's people in jails and prisons. So Eileen, would you like to start us out?
Yes, welcome everybody. I'm happy to be here and be part of this webinar. I'm going to frame a little bit the issue of trauma first, so we're all on the same page in terms of definitions, and then we'll get into some of the effects on the worker. I've been a clinical social worker with over 20 years experience working with survivors of trauma, mostly sexual trauma, and I teach at Catholic University. I research on this issue. I write about this issue often in multiple ways. So really happy to be here to talk about it. And I think it's really important when we talk about trauma to frame both our clinical understanding of what trauma is, as well as sort of our general understanding in society. Clinically, when we think about trauma, we think about the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders and the PTSD diagnosis. However, most people who experience trauma have other types of events in their lives that don't rise to the level of the diagnostic criteria. So trauma is broadly psychological trauma, events that overwhelm our normal capacity to cope. So people might have all sorts of experiences that are distressing and overwhelming, but they cope fairly well until they don't. And then they engage in behaviors for helping them to cope that actually can cause more problems and get them in trouble with the criminal justice system. So we see that quite frequently. So we're talking about the distress after the event, more so oftentimes than the event itself. We know that folks who experience trauma, have all sorts of other mental health issues aside from post-traumatic stress disorder if they meet the criteria for that disorder. And so we see substance abuse, we see bipolar disorder, we see depressive disorders, anxiety disorders, all sorts of problems of functioning that are very, very common for folks who have trauma. We know that most folks who are incarcerated have had multiple experiences with trauma. So that frames our sort of academic or clinical understanding of the issue of trauma.
Okay, well, I'd like to talk a little bit about the correctional context and build a little bit on what you're saying, Eileen. My background is also in social work, but I have a doctorate in criminology, and I did my doctoral dissertation on correctional staff burnout, spirituality, and resilience. Now, it seems obvious, but it's worth repeating, and the data out there confirm clearly that prison work is very stressful. And this stress is significantly correlated with physical and mental health problems, including depression, high blood pressure, substance abuse, burnout, and higher risk of suicide. Now, correction officers, shockingly, have the second highest mortality rate of any occupation in the US. And on average, they're seriously assaulted at least twice during their 20-year career. And often we witness some of this. The life expectancy of an American CO is 59 years. It's just about 18 months past their last paycheck, compared to the current average of 78 years. And so it's especially true for correction officers, but anyone who works in a prison or a jail is subject to the same environmental stressors that they are. So we need to be conscious ourselves of the risks to our emotional and spiritual health as we go into minister with prisoners and people in detainees in jails. When I was doing my research, I did a number of interviews, and one of the chaplains said rather poignantly, sometimes we have a sort of gallows humor. We do a lot of making fun of things that maybe other people might find strange. It's our way of dealing with what goes on inside. But other people don't understand that. There's a kind of profound sadness in seeing people at their absolute worst, they're so far down, they're not really who they are. And you know that, so there's a profound sadness associated with that. It doesn't last a long time for me, but when I'm in it with them, I'm really in it with them. And I think any of us who have been in those environments know what it's like. You're surrounded by suffering, and if you're a person with any empathy, you can't not feel that. Um, so that's part of the context for us as chaplains. Now, because we work in an environment like this, you have to remember we're working with people who are being held against their will. And as Eileen mentioned, many of these people suffer from long-term mental health problems associated with previous trauma, often combined with addictive behavior as well. And I'd say many, if not most of these people, their lives have been marked by deprivation, poverty, abuse, racism, neglect, and violence. So, and any prison, any jail, there's a constant threat of violence. It may not be loud, but it's there in the background. It's always a possibility. And those of us who work in jails and prisons are invariably exposed to violence, either by witnessing it directly or vicariously by hearing the stories of violence that occur in the lives of inmates, or even hearing from correction officers what they saw or did that particular day. So to put it simply, not only inmates are traumatized by the harsh conditions of confinement, there's plenty of empirical evidence that suggests that correctional staff, including us, chaplains, who witness the violence of prison firsthand or secondhand, are subject to severe stress from vicarious traumatization. Now, in a recent study of correction officers, it's shocking when you see these statistics. 60% of those surveyed met the criteria for PTSD according to the DSM. I believe it was DSM-4 at the time that this was done. 75% of them reported ongoing feelings of anger. 70% of them reported feeling hardened or indifferent to the suffering of inmates. This is also called corrections fatigue. 60% reported ongoing feelings of chronic fear at work. And half the people reported feeling emotionally numbed by their work at the end of the day. So the point of all this is that if we don't work consciously to avoid that, we too can fall into the same trap of corrections fatigue. When I was interviewing, again, one of the chaplains described burnout very vividly. He said, you just dread going in. You just sit in your car and you just kind of drop your head and you say, I just need 5 more minutes before I go in there. Everything becomes a chore. It's difficult to go to meetings. You feel that you have nothing more to give, but everybody wants something from you. So you just go home and you're exhausted and you fall on the couch. That's what burnout feels like, and we all experience it at different degrees, but it can be avoided, and it can be helped if we begin going down that road. We can turn it around. As chaplains, of course, I think in general we do a better job in terms of coping with stress, particularly because of our spirituality. But we have to remember that just like COs, we are frontline staff in the prison, and our work requires us, invites us to interact directly with prisoners everywhere in the institution. So really, just aside from COs and perhaps some medical staff, we chaplains probably have the greatest exposure to the daily lives of prisoners and detainees. And so my research showed that our spirituality is really our greatest defense against burnout, cynicism, and correctional fatigue. And the factors of spirituality that were most effective in helping us remain resilient are our connection to others and having a hopeful outlook. But I want to hold there and go back to you, Eileen. That's sort of and I'll say more about our spirituality and how we can use it to guard us against the environmental stressors that are inevitable in the places that we work.
Thanks, Father George. Yeah, I think that when we have an understanding of the work with trauma survivors and how it affects us, we are really able to understand this idea of vicarious trauma, right? That when we sit with people who've had experiences, historical trauma, going back generations from oppression and marginalization and racism and all sorts of horrible experiences that people come to this world with, we absorb that. We have human reactions to things that happen to human beings that never should happen to them. And so we are transformed. And so that idea of sitting in the car, right, is our resistance to being present with this level of pain, because we're empathic and we are sort of like a sponge. We absorb these experiences of others because we want to hold the burden with them in our work. And so it affects us. It affects us quite personally. And in terms of the signs and symptoms of vicarious trauma, there's lots of research on this that shows we are transformed in how we think, how we behave, our spiritual connections, and our practices, our faith traditions that sustain us can be shaken by some of the stories we hear. And it can affect us. It can also affect our ability to do our job, right? So the sense of the reward we get from doing the work can be really overshadowed by the toll it takes on us in doing it. So the idea that vicarious trauma has both personal and professional impacts is very well established in a lot of the literature in social work and psychology and in other fields. And so we know that we can feel pulled to go beyond our job too. We have, boundary issues where we do more than we should, or we agree to do things we shouldn't do because we want to help, or we want to be liked or get approval in some way. And so we can be pulled to cross our professional boundaries because we're sort of off our center. I use the analogy of being at the beach and sort of standing in the water, and this wave comes and it sort of pulls you back, it knocks you off your center. And vicarious trauma is a lot like that. You experience multiple waves where you're just trying to stand still, but you're being knocked around by your emotional reaction to the experiences. And so that can make it difficult to maintain really good boundaries in your work and good decision making and clarity in your role. So, I think, Father George, you spoke to a lot of this in your research, which is really, really helpful. But in terms of building resilience, certainly spirituality is one way to do that. But I think also having a sense of your strengths in the work, you're going to make mistakes, or you're going to do things you maybe in hindsight feel like, oh, I shouldn't have done that. But, if you focus on what you did well, if you learn from your mistakes, if you use humor, I think that idea of gallows humor is very common. And take some time to rest, meditate, pray, and rest between appointments, and make sure that you're taking care of yourself in the most basic ways, eating a good meal before you go and meet with the folks you're meeting with, get enough sleep, get enough exercise, and sort of clear your mind of all of the distractions to be really present. I think those are really helpful techniques in building resilience, as well as our self-regulation of our reactions to the work. If we kind of think about our empathy like a switch, we turn it on and we turn it off. If you think about kind of your everyday life, if you're just open to all sorts of experiences from people that you interact with, you're going to get flooded and overwhelmed and unable to really sustain the work. And so, finding rituals to get yourself ready to do the work and then to leave it there. Oftentimes I use my commute to and from my appointments to kind of process what I talked about with my clients and to leave it and not bring it home. So finding those techniques for self-care are really important.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because I do the same thing. I find the commute, of course, I'm able to commute in a really beautiful area, and that helps a lot. But I want to pick up too on the idea of protecting ourselves and resilience in terms of our spirituality. And I would say that key for us chaplains to maintain our emotional and mental balance, working in the prison, is to be attentive to the spiritual part of our lives where we maintain our connection to other people and to God. Our greatest enemies working in the prison system or the jail system, to name the demons, are cynicism and isolation. And the connection works against, to counter those, For example, prayer. Are you connected to God? It seems simple, but do you have a daily prayer life? Do you go to Mass regularly? Do you receive the sacraments? This is a way we can very much stay connected to God and to one another. Do you have a good and supportive community? If you're fortunate like me and live in a religious community, then I have my brothers here. Do you have a spouse who's connected to your work? Do you talk about your work appropriately with your family members? You don't want to bring some of the awful stuff home, but someone who understands what it's like and can listen when you're not there. Do you have a spiritual director? This is really important. We're going into a place that is spiritually a battleground in some respects. So be sure that you have somebody, a priest, minister, a spiritual director, a good friend, a prayer partner, a Bible study group, where you can bring this and talk about the things that are going on. What's your support and peer relationship with other chaplains where you are, whether they're volunteers or whether they're staff? It's really important that we maintain good interfaith, ecumenical relations with our chaplains, because if we're fighting, then that doesn't set a very good example for the prisoners, and it degrades our work and our resilience. And finally, do you have support from 12-step programs, or do you engage in some sort of personal therapy, whether it's individual or group? We can't be of any help to anybody if we're not dealing with our own issues. And so it's always, and we never get to a place where we've dealt with them. So it's an ongoing process, and therapy and 12-step groups, all these things are not signs of weaknesses, they're signs of strength and resilience. And they're out there, and they're definitely something that we need to avail ourselves of. The other thing in terms of the spirituality is, in addition to being connected to people, is maintaining a hopeful outlook. Now, I don't mean that we have to be Pollyannish or naive, but we have to actively fight against the temptation to become cynical in our work. One of the chaplains described it as, she said, we call it pulling the petals off a flower. Pulling the petals off a flower like a daisy. When you start working in corrections, your flower is full, but by the time you get done, if you don't work in keeping it full, you're going to be without relationships, without much of anything. Because the systems we work in are deeply cynical. While we talk about corrections, there's actually very little in the systems that are really serious about correcting people. We still work in this country in a very punitive, vengeful, and dehumanizing system. And as chaplains, we have to work to cultivate a counter narrative to the culture of death and punishment and division all around us. It goes back to the principles of connection. Our prayer life. Are we connected to God? Do we go to Mass? Do we avail ourselves of the sacraments? What do you put in your mind? What do you read and watch on TV? What do you read online? Avoid internet trolling and the polemics that go on, and just the hateful dialogue and that you see. It's poisonous. Do you play? Do you have hobbies? Do you take advantage or avail yourself of the support in your community? These things are critical, because if we don't attend to these things, we can't avoid the effects of burnout, because we're constantly exposed. And somebody asked a question. We just got a question about the chronic anger. That's one aspect of, I think, and fear as well. There's a sort of hypervigilance that you see among correction officers, especially, because they always have to be aware and alert of the situation. We need to too, but they're trained particularly to do this. And so when you're going around all day being hyper vigilant about the possibility of something happening, your adrenaline's always there, you're always on edge, and that is exhausting after a while. So we have to be we don't want to fall into the trap of being so vigilant that and let the fear of the situation or the anger that we feel at seeing some of the suffering overcome us. And that's where the boundaries that Eileen was talking about kick in, and we need to know when to step back, know when to say no, know when to let go of something that we have no control over. So anything that you want to add or to that, Eileen?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the way in which we are able to be resilient is it isn't that we shut down our fear, right? Of course, we are going to have natural fear reactions. And in many ways, that's parallel on some small level to what it feels like to those living in those environments every day. And so that gives us great empathy, right, for those we're serving, to use that to understand how, on some small piece of our own experience, it connects to the experience of those in prisons. And so the other thing that I wanted to respond to is a question that came in about COs in the prison settings who don't smile, who don't seem to appear to be enjoying their jobs. Question is, most COs do not smile, will tell you they hate their jobs. This is in a women's prison. They have staff shortages and not regular access to counselors or psychologists. And so, you're not just hearing the experiences of the prisoners, but the experiences of the COs themselves who turn to you for support or resources. And so you're often providing a lot of emotional support to people you didn't expect to be doing that with. So I think in that way, you might have to set some boundaries about what you're able to do, and the realities of the situation and the limitations. And the question is, I'm frustrated because I can't do much but listen, empathize, and pray. That's a lot. Yeah. I think we underestimate the value of bearing witness to pain and being with someone. That is a lot more than others do. And I think when we sit quietly and we listen and we are with someone and we take in what they're sharing with us, we are doing them a service. And so I wouldn't underestimate that.
Yeah, that's really critical, Eileen. And I would add to that, while we are normally seeing ourselves as ministering primarily to the detainees in the jails or the inmates in a prison, we also can and have to minister to the correction officers and staff as much as possible. I find that you can't be seen in front of prisoners like chumming around with the COs, because that everything's so tribal there, and they won't trust you if they think that you're on the other side. The fact is, a lot of the COs that I work with are Catholic. Most of them don't go to church because they work shift work and they don't get to do that. And but they're dealing with all of these issues both at work and at home, and they don't get a lot of support in their mind from the administrators and managers as a rule, especially the line officers. So it's natural in a way for us to be a resource for them. And there's nothing that stops us from meeting with them outside the gate, meeting with them in the coffee room, away from prisoners, taking a moment, just having a conversation, offering to pray for them, with them, sharing with them, just being human with them. Because we're really doing the prisoners a big favor and help when we help the staff not be as stressed, not be as fearful or angry at what they're doing. It's probably one of the most difficult, thankless jobs in the world. And one of my recommendations in my dissertation was that we come up with ways of creating volunteer chaplaincy programs specifically for the officers, not prisoners, but separate, so that somebody would go in whose job would be to minister to them, because they, aside from sort of reacting to emergencies and traumatic events like suicides or attacks in prison, there's not, to my knowledge, any ongoing on-site pastoral care for correctional staff anywhere. If there is, I'd love to hear about it. Any other questions out there, Eileen?
There's a question about helping with restorative justice.
Mm-hmm.
Says, how can we better help with restorative justice concepts to make a change?
Well, I think that's a good question. And maybe I would turn it a little bit in the context of what we're talking about today in terms of restoring ourselves. Restorative justice is a different paradigm of justice that looks at a way of healing what's been broken in the community when crimes happen. the current system we have is punitive, and it disempowers victims and prisoners and the community, and it's all about punishment. And so restorative justice is about how do we undo the damage that crime has, and restore the person, both the offender and the victim, to full life and community. And I think for us, we're stepping into this environment that's punitive and toxic. And so, how do we be agents of restoration, both within that, for the prisoners, for the staff, and for ourselves? And we can't be of any use if we're not healthy ourselves in terms of restoring our balance of body, mind, and spirit. So, for example, some concrete things. It may be obvious, but believe me, do as I do, not as I say. I mean, do as I say, not as I do. While you're at work, get outside. Get outside the prison for a moment. They said, I went to a training recently, and it was very powerful what someone said. You know, where I work at San Quentin, we have, as you walk into the prison, which is an ugly place inside, but outside it's absolutely beautiful, and we have this breathtaking view of the San Francisco Bay. And somebody said, when you get to a place where all you see is the parking lot, you know you're burned out. So if all you're seeing is like what's right in front of you, and you're not taking in the beauty of what's out there in the world, then you need to be attentive to that, and you need to restore your sense of your place in the world and your balance. We need to exercise and take care of our bodies, walk, play golf, go to yoga classes, be eating healthy. If you notice the stuff that CEOs often eat, it's terrible. It's unhealthy food. It's fast food. It's junk. They tend to get overweight as a result and unhealthy. And we can do the same thing. So avoid unhealthy food and alcohol and sugar. Don't drink 100 cups of coffee a day. And just do things that are going to be de-stressing. Breathe. Go sit in the chapel by yourself for 5 minutes. Find a quiet spot you can get to. These are ways you can restore yourself. And in the same process, as we do that, then we're going to be more able to work toward restoration on a larger scale.
Yeah, I think those tips are really helpful because we, in many ways, are the instrument of our work, right? So if you're a musician and you play guitar, you have to take care of your instrument. So as the instrument of your work, you have to take care of yourself. And this means physically as well. So I think, really being mindful of how you are tuning your instrument every day is the way to approach it. And then to create a self-care plan. What do I do if I leave a meeting and I feel triggered by something someone shared with me? Or how do I not become preoccupied with the details of the story I heard from an inmate? Having that plan, so I'm going to talk to this person, or I'm going to take a walk, and I'm going to not watch movies that have a lot of trauma narratives, or watch TV shows about prisons. We expose ourselves to a lot of trauma in the name of entertainment. So I like to limit my trauma diet and limit how much trauma I am exposed to outside of my work. And so being mindful about those kinds of things can really go a long way towards resilience.
Mm-hmm. Somebody wrote a statement. They said that a young man who was key to their pastoral services got into trouble and was transferred. And they were ordered not to have any contact with them. That's often the case. When we're working in the system, we have to abide by the rules of the system in terms of contact with prisoners and families. But that doesn't mean that we can't still be of help. And I think we have to be creatively subversive in the sense that you don't break the rules, because then you're gonna get fired or lose your clearance. But you can find you don't have to do everything. You can find other people, you can refer people in the community. And oftentimes I tell people, not every part of prison ministry means going into prison. There are some people who just don't want to or can't go into prison, but they can do just as important work for people on the outside. And so we need to be thinking in terms of networking and coordinating and referring, which is kind of what we're doing, or trying to build in the Catholic Prison Ministry Coalition. Our putting people together and putting the resources together so that when something like this happens, when one of our inmates or detainees or clients gets sent to a different prison or gets sent somewhere in the community where we're not really supposed to be in touch with them, we can still be of help to them by getting them to the people who can help them at the time. It goes back to this idea that we can't do everything, and we're not the saviors of the world. That job's been taken, but we have so many resources, especially in the Catholic community, with things like Catholic Charities and various groups in different cities that do wonderful work with ex-offenders and people out on parole.
There was another question, Father George, that came in about resources to address burnout. One of the best resources I found comes from a researcher and writer named Beth Hudnall Stamm, S-T-A-M-M, and she has a self-assessment scale called the Professional Quality of Life Scale. And she also has a website called proqual.org, PROQOL.org. And what's wonderful about this resource is that she has this tool that allows you to assess what is called compassion satisfaction, right? Mm-hmm. The joy that can come from caring for others and the satisfaction with our work, along with compassion fatigue, which is basically the vicarious trauma concept we've been talking about, and the level of burnout. And then she has, so you can do a self-assessment in those three areas. And then she has some concrete resources and tips for self-care. And that's just really a wonderful open resource. You don't have to buy a book and you don't have to go to a training that I recommend to a lot of folks who work in environments with people who've been through a lot of trauma. So I think that would be a really good place to start. Some of the other pieces of writing are more academic or more researcher-y, but Beth Hudnall Stamm has a really great jumping off point and some resources on her website.
That sounds great, and perhaps we can get that link up on our web. On the people can email to the site that sponsoring this, and we can get that information to them. I think somebody else said that they're using NAMI and other resources to offer mental health training to our volunteers. Now, I'm not familiar with that particular thing. Are you, Eileen?
Yeah, so that's the National Association of Mental Illness, NAMI, and they have a lot of great resources. And I think they're just sort of general mental health resources that are out there. So that is a good place to start too for information and resources. And the National Association of Social Workers, as well as the American Association of Psychologists, they do have references, resources for self-care for professionals too.
Yeah, I think ideally too, as we develop the resources that we're trying to for the Catholic Prison Ministry Coalition, that we can come up with some way to direct people more to some of the more useful and perhaps more specific to the kind of work we're doing resources that are out there, because there's a lot. And we will post the link to the proqual.org at some point, probably more likely when this is recorded and then accessible later on. That'd be easier to do it that way. Now, someone else writes that at the prison they work in Iowa, there's no full-time chaplain, and that's pretty typical of most places, I think. 2 volunteer priests come in and 2 deacons come in for an hour a month. And this is at a women's prison. And the person says, I'm there the rest of the time. I'm not sad about this, but I wish the Catholics who come in to volunteer would want to get involved more than 1 hour a month. Yeah, I mean, I wish there was a lot more awareness in the Catholic community about prison ministry. Part of that, I think, is our duty to teach and get the word out. But the important thing I would say here is that the person writing this, how wonderful it is that you're there and that you want to go in and that you're involved. That's the start. So I think oftentimes it's sort of the glass half empty, half full. I personally wish there were a lot more priests and men and women coming into prison to do prison ministry. But I also have to stop and think how grateful I am that I have the opportunity to do this work. So I think it's while we always wish there would be more support, there'd be more participation, I would say to this person, never discount the value of what you're doing. Your presence there is every bit as important as the people who come in for the sacraments, because it's the day-to-day connection that I think people really crave and benefit from. So it can be discouraging, but I think that's also from the negative spirit of the place we work that kind of wants us to be discouraged. But that's part of the work of our spiritual lives, is to counter that narrative with gratitude and a recognition that what we're doing is helping people. We're not necessarily changing the prison system. I don't think we can in our lifetime, but we can make a difference.
I think that's a great point, and it comes back to the sort of remark that, you know, all we do is sit with someone and listen and pray with them. And you know, I think when we look at big changes, trying to make big changes in the world, we're going to be very, very frustrated. It's like trying to make a sharp left turn in the Titanic. But it's the small things that we do one-on-one with people that make a difference in their lives, that over time will connect to others and make differences. It's the small ripple effects that we're able to do.
Exactly. The prisoners at San Quentin have a group called Brothers Keepers, and what it is, it's basically peer counseling and suicide prevention. And they all wear little starfish pins, and I'm sure you've all heard this story, but you know, it's like the man who sees a child throwing walking down the beach throwing starfish who wash up on the shore back into the ocean. And he says, "You're not going to save all these starfish," and the child says, "No, but I'm saving these." And so that's part of it too. We can't fix the system, but each person we encounter is unique and important, and you never know how a simple presence with that person, a prayer, some empathy, kindness can change their lives. And I've had people write to me years later, 10 or 15 years after I was working back in Boston. I can't remember them at all, but they say, well, it really helped me when you did this or that. And it's wonderful when that happens. And more often than not, we never know, but it does happen.
Yeah, and I think that the idea of, someone just wrote in, the idea of offering days of reflection and prayer and encouragement for volunteers. I think the more support and resources you're able to give to volunteers, the more resilient they'll be. Mm-hmm. So, many of us who work in full-time roles or part-time even roles have a lot more strategies to be resilient. Volunteers who come 1 hour a week or less frequently than us, they don't really have a good strategy. So taking information and sharing it widely and spreading the word, offering prayer opportunities, reflection opportunities, support, they go a really long way in helping others be more resilient.
They do. And, it's interesting seeing the questions. It seems like a lot of these questions are about volunteers. And I think that's something that we need to be more attentive to, because you can't just walk into prison unprepared. You have good intentions, but I think partly the training that people need to do on the front end is to kind of arm themselves to know what they're getting into. One of the things too I've noticed along those lines is that when we start working in prison or jails, you walk into an environment that is just emotionally heavy. The suffering is very much in the air. It's like walking into back in the days when people could smoke inside of a room. If you walked in a room with people smoking, you'd walk out and your clothes would smell. It's almost like that with the fear, the stress, and the pain in the prison. You absorb it. And I found that being in prison or jail for 2 hours felt like being in there for 6 hours. It's an intensity that you have to almost build yourself up to get used to. And so for volunteers, for people walking in there with good intentions but no training, you're opening yourself up to kind of just being deluged by very strong and often negative feelings and emotions. So I would say that the first thing to do is, if you are a chaplain, prepare your volunteers, have people be praying ahead of time, have people understanding what they're going into, that again, that they can't go in there, not going there to fix the system, and they're also not going there to bring Jesus to the prison, because guess what? Jesus is already there, and he's been there for a long time. We don't go in there to bring God to the prisoners. More often than not, I find they bring God to me. But we go in there to share something that we have, to share our faith and our hope. And but if we don't have faith and we don't have hope, what are we going to share? So we really have to go in there armed and prepared with the right reasons and the right spirit. And that, again, that comes from being prepared. And also, there's some good resources out there, and I would refer people to Dale Resinella's recent book, a couple books about prison ministry, which again, we'll put those up on the link. But Dale Resinella works in Florida on death row there, and I love his writing because he describes vividly the kind of things that we need to do as Catholics to prepare ourselves to do this kind of work effectively. Another book out there that I highly recommend, and is written by an evangelical friend of mine back in Boston. His name is Lenny Spitale, Spitale, and it's basically, I forget the exact title, but it's Understanding Prison Ministry Inside and Out. And he describes his own experience of having been a prisoner in New Hampshire and then becoming an evangelical minister, and the sorts of things that he does in his faith that I think is translatable to any of us. Anyone who's Christian, Catholic, or Protestant would find that book a great benefit. So Lenny Spitale is the author. You can find it on Amazon. Any other questions in there, Eileen?
Not that I've seen yet. No, I mean, I think there might be other folks who haven't written them in yet, but I think
Okay.
I would like folks to think about, what am I doing daily for self-care? One of the problems I run into with social workers is they think self-care is something like you bank. You save up and then you go get a massage, or you wait till you're really, really, really burnt out and then you take your vacation. And self-care has to be a daily practice. It has to be a mindful daily practice. If you wait till you're really burnt out, it's going to take a lot more to come back from that than every day checking in with yourself and thinking, how am I affected by my work? What's staying with me? What do I need to process? What is this tapping into from my own life experiences? And making me a little more personally engaged and less objective about my work. So thinking about processing through the work and checking in with yourself and taking care of yourself in whatever way makes sense to you. Everybody's gonna, just like trauma is subjective, and trauma means different things to different people. What's traumatic for me might not be for you. Self-care is subjective. What works for me might not work for someone else. And so thinking very mindfully about how do I regulate my emotions? What do I need to do to feel centered and calm emotionally? What do I need to do to take care of myself physically? And then how do I make my environment feel a little bit more welcoming? And that could be hard in a prison, right? But maybe you have something you can bring in with you that is personally soothing for you, something in your pocket, or around your neck or your wrist that you feel like, you can touch and you feel some sense of calmness with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think in all of these, it's important to remember that we're talking about physical and emotional wellness, but they're completely connected to our spiritual lives. We're not separate spirits from our bodies. And so if we want to take care of our spirits, we have to attend to our emotions and our physical needs. Now, in terms of the spiritual life, somebody made a comment. They said it's impossible to do something in the name of Jesus and nothing happens. Everything we do in the name of Jesus has fruit, but we don't always see it. Absolutely true. That's what I meant earlier, is we may never know how we've affected somebody's life. But if we've been going into this in the spirit of our faith in Christ and ministering to the words and the spirit of the gospel, then we may not see the results exactly, but we know our faith tells us something is going on. along those lines, a way that we can protect ourselves spiritually, just like we can protect ourselves from burning out by taking care of ourselves, we need to kind of arm ourselves in the sense of when Paul writes in Ephesians about putting on the armor of Christ. We're walking into a battleground, and we're walking into a place that that can be really evil. It's not the prisoners themselves; it's a system that is dehumanizing and oppressive, I think. And I find that often when I'm walking into the prison, I'm consciously asking for protection. If you know the St. Michael prayer, it's a very traditional Catholic prayer, but it talks about defending us against evil. And we want to be spiritually defended against the sorts of things that we're coming up against, which manifest themselves as violence, as racism, as oppression. They're very real, but the fact is, our God is more powerful and more real, and so we're not weak, we're not defenseless at all, but we have to be aware that we need to be defended against these things, and to draw on these spiritual resources and to draw on the prayers of the saints to get us through this work, so that we can continue, like this person said, in the name of Jesus, to minister to the men and women who God's sending us to be with. Someone said, someone highlighted the good work of Archbishop Gustavo in San Antonio, who's active in the prison ministries along with Bishop Boulette, celebrating the Triduum in 3 different prisons. If volunteers see our ordinaries involved, they will feel the impetus to continue. Yeah, sure. And here we have our Archbishop comes at least twice a year, celebrates Mass. One of the things, and we absolutely need to invite pastors and bishops to come in. But remember, we're the church, so a lot of it is it's encouraging when we get our leaders to come in, but we can't rely on that. We have to. I think if we lead, they will follow. And so, if you're going in, be sure you invite your pastor, invite the bishop to come in. But you're doing the grassroots work. I think is the most important work. And if you're already doing it, pat yourself on the back for that. Last thing I would want to say is forgiveness. I think a lot of times what I find among prisoners, the men that I work with at San Quentin, the thing they want most of all is forgiveness. And we need that too. We're working around people whose lives are complex, but our lives are complicated too. And we all have issues in our lives where we need healing and forgiveness as well. So the same advice that you give to prisoners, practice it on yourself and know when you need to seek help. Confession is a great place to do this, reconciliation. But again, I find oftentimes that when we're speaking to prisoners and when I'm preaching, I'm often preaching a message that I need to hear myself. And so be attentive to that in your own life. If there are people that you need to forgive or need to forgive you, this is work on that because we want the prisoners to do it, but we have to do it as well. Anything else, Eileen?
Yeah, the concept of forgiveness brought to mind for me the work of Everett Worthington. And he has done some writing on what he calls decisional unforgiveness and how to get to forgiveness. And so there might be some value in reading his work. He's written quite a bit on forgiveness in the process of getting to forgiveness for people. So that's just Great. What that brought to mind. But I think it is self-forgiveness is often a big part of maintaining our resilience, right? That we have limits to what we're able to do. And sometimes we judge ourselves for that. And it's important to be aware that those limitations are in place by virtue of our role, and they're important for a lot of reasons. And then we have to place limits around our work because we need a well-balanced life. And we need the other aspects of our life to feed us emotionally, spiritually, personally, so that we are able to do this work. And so I think of the sponge metaphor with vicarious trauma, where the more we're exposed to, the more we absorb. So like a sponge, you get to a certain point where you're just not able to take any more in. You're just saturated. And so we've got to have those moments of kind of wringing ourselves out and renewing ourselves so that we are able to do the work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Somebody wrote in about how helpful it would be for us as chaplains or volunteers to make contact with healthcare staff in the prison. And this is really important. I mean, both Eileen and I have backgrounds in clinical social work. While I'm still a licensed clinical social worker, I don't use that title at work, but I use the skills that I learned. And what I find really important is networking with mental health. I don't know, it may vary around the country. There's often a bit of a reluctance on the part of mental health staff to get too involved with the religious groups because don't forget, we're not just Catholics there. We have all kinds of different groups and a lot of fundamentalist groups. And I think often prisoners are subjected to a very simplistic form of religion that they can just pray their problems away. And that's unhealthy and unhelpful. But I think if you're able to develop a relationship through referral to mental health, when they see, as long as they see you're not crazy, they'll work with you. And I think they really, in my experiences, they really appreciate when we bring to their attention somebody who is in need of mental health. And of course, as chaplains, we have a duty to let people, the mental health person will know if somebody is threatening harm to him or herself or anyone else. So we can be a real resource for them and work professionally with them and help them. But we also have to counter, unfortunately, the some of the prejudices that some of them have inherited from some of our well-meaning but perhaps misguided co-religionists and from other faith groups.
Yeah, I think countering the stigma about mental health is really difficult. And so if you have a relationship, you're establishing a relationship with someone in the prison and you see that they are really struggling, referring them for mental health treatment as much as possible in the prisons and sharing with them your own, experiences, if you have them, of reaching out, either peer support like a 12-step program or your own counseling to say, this is something I've done and I found it very valuable. That can go a long way towards reducing the mental health stigma.
Yes, exactly. And I think this also applies to working with staff. I think you could probably, there are, in terms of personal experiences, you can be more forthcoming with staff than you should be with prisoners about your personal life. But I found it very effective to working with staff who deal with issues around depression or codependency or substance abuse. Just to be a resource for them is important, and helping them to refer, because both mental health has a stigma both for prisoners and for correction officers. Correction officers' culture is one that they're, for whatever reason, personality or training, they feel like they have to be tough. They're the ones who protect other people. And if they see themselves as weak, they see themselves as failing in that. And that's something that we really have to help them get through and past in order for them to be effective. For prisoners, often I find that there's a reluctance to go to mental health because they don't want to be put on drugs and made a zombie or called a bug or have parole denied them because they're mental health. But all these are kind of prison myths. I absolutely, and guys who come in and are depressed and think they can pray that away really need to be encouraged to go and seek mental health counseling and perhaps medication for that. Medication, again, is not a sign of weakness or a lack of faith. I try to remind the guys that God gave us these tools and that it's good for us to use them when we need them. Just like I wouldn't tell a diabetic not to take insulin, but to pray about it. Same thing with our brain chemicals. We can't mess with that stuff. And fortunately, we live in a time where God has given us tools to handle things that in the past people just had to suffer through. I think we probably have time for maybe one more question if anything else has popped up. And I would say while we're waiting too, a lot of the things that we've discussed today, we've referred to several texts and to resources, we'll make sure we get these put up on the site when this is made, when this webinar is published, so that people can have ready access to those resources. And we would also invite people who are watching or listening to continue to send in what you're doing. If you know of anybody who has an effective program, training volunteers, for example, to deal with some of these issues, working with correctional staff as volunteers, anything out there, because what we found is that there's a lot of really good work going on in the country, but we're all siloed in our individual jobs and separated. And prisons, of course, are very isolating environments. So we would like to be able to find a way to reach out to one another and share the wonderful resources that are going on in the Catholic community and Catholic prison ministry around the country.
Father George, it seems like there's one last question about re-entry help. The question is, our diocese in Des Moines doesn't offer re-entry program. So women released in Des Moines don't have a program to go to. I usually try to get them phone numbers for St. Vincent de Paul, bus schedules, other places that offer social services. So is there any kind of guidance you have around that?
I think that's a good question, and I think it really varies from place to place in the country. Vincent de Paul, Catholic Charities, those are usually the best go-to places. I don't think too many dioceses have the kind of reentry programs that this person is saying right now. Should we? Yes. Do we? Probably not. But there are social service agencies out there, and we can also go outside of the Catholic community. I worked for a number of years in an evangelical halfway house in Boston, and they did wonderful work with men coming out of prison, often after a long period of time. So I think we can network with other people of faith and other church communities as well. If our particular diocese doesn't have it, there's probably somebody out there who's doing it in the community. But again, it's the sort of thing that we have to kind of do that research locally. However, if people out there who are listening know of such resources, please, please, please let us know, because if we're able to get this stuff up and accessible for people, then it would make the last person's comment, it would make their job a lot easier if they had some sense of who to call or what they could do to help these men and women as they get out of prison.
Yeah, it seems like there's not a good sort of centralized resource on that. I know here in Washington, D.C., there's an organization called Guest House in Alexandria, Virginia, and they, accept women coming for reentry and supportive services and housing. And, you just sort of find them by luck oftentimes, it seems. They're a private nonprofit and they struggle. I think they could do a lot more if they had more financial resources. So supporting those kinds of organizations is really important.
Yeah, and I mean, at San Quentin, we have a really good reentry program that's secular in nature, but it's very, very helpful. And I know back in Massachusetts, there was a handbook for people getting out of prison that was superb. And again, that's the sort of thing that I can get that link up for people to access. I believe it was online. And while it may be unique to Massachusetts, there might be some things in there that people would find helpful in other parts of the country as well.
Great. All right, so it looks like we're at time. And I think that there will be follow-up, information provided in the recording with some of the resources that we've discussed. And I think that's all the time we have.
Yes. Well, thank you, Eileen, and thank you all for joining us today. God bless you in your work, and just stay connected to Jesus.
Thank you.